Hi everyone, welcome to this conversation today. My name is Aibami Adidini. I'm the content marketing manager at the EnAccess Foundation. Today we have a program called the Open Source Media Dialogue, which is a platform where experts can share their experiences, challenges, and opportunities in the open source, while they're implementing open source technologies. The goal of this is not only to inspire, also to educate our audience, about potential of open source in energy access. Today we have the opportunity of meeting one of the brightest minds in the industry, Stefan. Who I'm going to be given the opportunity to introduce himself. Hi, Stefan. Welcome.
Hi, Ayomami. Thanks for having me. And hey, everybody. As said, I'm Stefan. I'm one of the managing directors of the Access to Energy Institute. And in this capacity, I'm responsible for the Prospect project, which I might come back a bit later to in the conversation.
Thank you. Jump straight into the conversation. How did you become involved in open source in energy access? And what are some of the projects you've led or contributed to?
Thanks. Actually, my first touch points with open source in itself, it's been quite a while already. It's in the late 90s, mid 90s, when basically Linux became available. And I, as a student, always had no money, tried to save some money by using open source software. So basically, since then, I've been more on the user side of open source, but have been actively more and more watching the space. Afterwards, due to software development, much more engagement with open source software, working with open source, building on top of open source. But the biggest shift basically came later. When I was working in the energy access sector with a private company called Moviso, we were one of the first pioneers to deploy solar home system, especially in Eastern Africa. And we had quite a substantial software built around to monitor the installations, to make sure basically everything was working. And during this time, pay-as-you-go came up as a technology. And the first thing basically we did, and it was actually together with an EnAccess Foundation, I think it was back in 2017 or 18, we decided to publish our pay-as-you-go technology, at least as open access, in a joint effort to allow companies to be cross-compatible when it comes to pay-as-you-go technology. That was the first touch point with open source and energy access. And then, obviously, after joining the Access to Energy Institute in 2022, basically we kickstarted the Prospect project, which in itself is a fully open source project. You can find it on GitLab, and you're more than welcome to check it out, try it on your own machine, see if you can make use of it. And I believe basically it's currently the largest single fully open source project in the energy access space.
Interesting. I mean, you've had this many years of experience in the open source industry, and I'm sure you've also had your fair share of challenges. So what are some of those challenges that you've encountered, and how were you able to overcome them?
Yeah, maybe beyond the purely technical challenges, you always have this, especially if you try to set up an open source solution that is also only dependent on other open source solutions, so basically no dependency on commercial solutions, you definitely very often have technical choices to make. You have to basically evaluate which way to go. If you cannot just simply fall back to, let's say, AWS or some other solutions, which are around and easy to purchase. But beyond the technical challenges, I think the key challenges are more on a social or in a psychological way. And very often you still encounter the perception of open source to be a more risky approach towards implementing a software if you compare it to basically an off-the-shelf commercial solution. So basically along the line saying, you know what, if it's free, it can't be good, or it can't be as good as basically a paid solution. So you have to overcome these hesitancies, these concerns, these perceptions. And still very often people sometimes confuse open source with open data. I'm not saying, okay, if basically my data, Prospect is a data platform. It's an open source data platform. So we very often encounter the perception that basically if I give my data to an open source platform, this data is free to everybody and is not protected. So basically what we have to do is you really work closely with stakeholders, educate and showcase the advantages and basically address these perceptions, these ideas, and really highlight the advantages for the users and for the stakeholders, and making sure basically these perceptions are not driving decisions anymore. These are basically the key challenges we still see in the adoption of open source in the energy access sector across the board.
Good, good. So, I mean, as one of the those who have been in the industry for years, you must have some vision for the sector. Do you want to share what are some of your visions for the open source sector, particularly for the open source energy access sector? What do you think the future is going to look like?
Yeah, maybe before really turning into what I see the big potentials and visions for open source and energy sector, maybe highlighting a few of the points we've achieved in the last couple of, let's say, years already, which basically drives our understanding of basically what is possible or what is the potential of open source. Basically, if I look at the example of Prospect, the open source data platform, basically I mentioned before, within only 2 years after basically kicking off the project, we have been massively adopted by countries, basically to monitor progress on electrification, to monitor programs they basically have deployed to increase access to clean and affordable energy for especially rural populations. And the biggest success we had recently was the endorsement of the World Bank to use Prospect as their regional aggregation platform for their multi-billion-dollar program called Ascent. So basically, even if you're rather new in the field of software for energy access, the willingness of basically key users, key stakeholders to jump on open source for the obvious advantages is there. So basically we see the potential, we see basically the willingness to endorse open source, and that's what I think will pave the way for an even broader adoption of open source in the energy access sector. So what I truly believe is that energy access is dependent on local, on small entrepreneurial companies in the countries basically where energy access is the key topic. So basically it's not so much about the big, large internationals, which are currently driving most of the electrification campaigns. I think it's about small companies, about entrepreneurs, about people who know their market, to know basically how to address customers who are currently left behind. And our vision for open source is to empower exactly these kind of users, these kind of companies, to basically be on par when it comes to best practices, when it comes to tools, when it comes to software, with the large international players. And we believe that open source is the key ingredient here, because that allows these smaller companies, these government programs, which also address these smaller companies, to basically work at the same level, to learn from the best, without basically having to reinvent the wheel, without having to buy very expensive software, without having to invent it internally. They can use the open source solutions as they are, they can adapt it to their needs, and they can make sure that they really fit into their particular market, their particular environment, and their niche, and their customer groups, and the challenges they have on the ground. So that's basically, in a nutshell, I think basically open source for energy access has the potential to really expedite the energy access programs massively, because it can unlock the power of the people on the ground, the people basically which are very close to the challenges and are part of the solution.
So that brings me to an important point. One of the misconceptions about the open source is that it's usually the non-profit that play in it. I mean, so I want us to look at it from the commercial interest angle. You know, how can open source tools be useful, you know, for commercial operating companies? I mean, companies who are for profit. You know, their major goal is to make money, and then also, how can it also be useful for public entities? I remember you mentioned that Prospect is being used by some countries now, but can you explain further, particularly in the context of energy access? And then also, are there specific business models, around open source tools that can be particularly useful in the energy access industry?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think that's also like a key challenge and a key question we have to answer to make open source fully successful. As you said, if people cannot make a living out of it, it is not as interesting as basically working on a commercial solution. So basically we have to be able to show, to to especially local IT professionals, to companies, that open source is a way for them to basically participate in a market where they cannot normally participate without these solutions. Basically allow them to be competitive and basically to effectively be part of this software market, so to say. And we have been working on this for quite a while now with Prospect, basically working with local IT consultancies, with local companies, to basically train them, to support them in the adoption of open source while creating their own business model around this solution. So basically, as a very, very particular example, we are working with basically with the governments of Burundi, with the governments of Malawi, to basically use Prospect as a tracking platform for their very ambitious electrification programs. But it's not basically us as Access to Energy Institute. It's basically local IT consultant in the regions, basically who work with the government, who do the support, who basically do the adoption, like the implementation of the software for the particular needs, who are there to onboard the companies to basically help to improve the software for this particular program, and basically can create a business around it. So basically, before having access to Prospect as open source solution, they couldn't compete against the large international offerings because there was basically no way for them to replicate what has been developed in the commercial space. But now with access to Prospect, there's basically a fully non-discriminatory, more democratized business approach towards these programs, which on the other side also massively reduces the costs for the governments, for the organizations, and they can basically use local IT consultants, regional IT consultants, which are much closer and much more basically addressable in a day-to-day business than basically large international companies. So I think this approach seems to work pretty well. So we see it in more and more countries, happening right now. And we encourage basically all of you who are basically listening here and would like to basically explore how business model in an open source world could work for you. Reach out to us. Basically, let's see if there is an opportunity in your country, in your market, and we basically will support you in setting up a business, in basically approaching this opportunity, because that's what we truly believe in. We believe basically in a very wide landscape of IT professionals working with the best tools in the market and making a business out of it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Stefan. So before I ask the final question, I'd like to remind our viewers that this platform is called the Open Source Leaders Dialogue, where we bring experts to share their experiences, challenges, success about open source technologies, particularly open source in EnAccess. Now, back to you, Stefan. For my final question, for companies or organizations who are skeptical of open sourcing their tools, or rather using open source tools, what would you advise?
I mean, it's a twofold question. Basically, for companies who are really considering open sourcing their tools, I mean, there's a little word of caution. It's more just it's not just putting it outside. It doesn't help much everybody if it's basically just published into an open source repository. Making it open source also includes basically making sure other people can use it. Sometimes basically you have to make the decision, is it worth it or is it not worth it? But I think for many cases it is worth it. Basically, if you have a solution where you feel like the adoption rate is not, you will not be able to basically fully drive the development of this crazy idea or this great solution alone. You need additional support. Then open sourcing, making it available for others who have basically want to solve the same problem as you, really can help. But I would recommend basically reaching out to companies, to organizations who have done that before. Basically ask them basically what were the key challenges, what are the key ingredients for success, like the EnAccess Foundation. They have been supporting companies very often in open sourcing their solutions. Also, we support companies in open sourcing basically proprietary software. So basically, I think most of the time it's worth it, but it should be well prepared. And you must have a clear objective while you open source a certain solution. The other side, adopting open source software, I mean, much more basically straightforward. So, open source is definitely the way for you as a company to reduce dependency on third-party solutions, which you don't know how they will develop in the future. It allows you to really focus on security. I think something that will become more and more important in the future. Secure solution, secure software, especially when it interacts with personal data. I think that will basically is something that will keep us very busy in the next years. And open source is definitely the way forward to increase the level of security and reliability of applications. So basically, I think there's no question asked. Open source is not the only solution, but I think it's one of the most important pieces of a solution to create a better world for all of us.
Wow, thank you so much, Stefan. You've been an engaging speaker. I hope to see the future success you talked about soon in the open source and in energy access industry.
Thank you very much, Ayubami.